Marla stood on my porch like the storm was just background noise. Her clipboard sealed in plastic like she'd planned for this. "Good evening," she said, clipped and precise. "We've had a report. There's an unapproved piece of equipment operating on your property, a generator." I told her the truth. It was a permitted standby unit. County inspected. Professionally installed. She didn't care. "It's causing a disturbance," she said, perfectly calm. "A nuisance complaint was filed. It violates quiet enjoyment. Section 8.3 prohibits continuous mechanical noise exceeding community standards. You're required to shut it down immediately." What she didn't know, what she never bothered to confirm, was what that generator was actually powering, and she put the threat in writing anyway. This wasn't just my house. It was an entire neighborhood sitting in darkness on low ground, with basements that stayed dry only as long as critical systems held. Homes, money, years of equity balanced on something as simple as a pump with no power behind it. That's the problem with HOA authority. It doesn't stop at what's reasonable. It expands until reality forces a reckoning. And in the hours that followed, Marla's certainty didn't just get questioned. It collapsed. But let me start from the beginning, before we dive into ID. Love to know where you're listening from today. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more interesting stories. Just like this, the first thing you learn about an ice storm is that it doesn't arrive like a weather event. It arrives like a decision the world suddenly makes without consulting you. 1 second, you're doing normal. It's quiet winter things. Moving a pot of chili to the back burner, checking the thermostat. Half listening to the local news in that distracted way people do, when they don't actually believe the worst will happen, and then the lights blink. Not a full outage, just a warning. A flicker so brief you almost convince yourself it was your eyes. Then the whole house goes dead. No hum from the fridge, no airflow from the vents, there's no orange glow from the microwave clock. It's not dramatic, it's unsettling. Like you've been dropped into a building after closing time. The world forgot to tell you. I stood there in my kitchen, holding a dish towel, staring at my reflection in the dark window over the sink. Outside, everything was washed. In that bluish winter gray, like the sun had been replaced with a dim bulb behind frosted glass. A hard tick-tick came from the maple tree in my front yard as ice formed on the branches. Then a crack, not close, but close enough. A sharp report like a gunshot down the street, followed by a low groan, a limb giving up under weight. That's when my phone buzzed. Power outage. Estimated restoration time. Unknown. Unknown. That word always makes it sound like the system has stopped caring. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. I'd lived through ugly winters. And I'd done the kind of quiet adult preparation no one applauds because it isn't cool, because no one believes you until the day it matters. I set the towel down, walked to the mudroom, and pulled on my boots. The back door stuck for a second, ice along the frame, then opened into a blast of air that stole my breath. The way cold always does when it's serious. The patio was glassy. A thin, clear sheet of ice over everything. My steps sounded cautious, slow. In the side yard, under a small awning, sat the generator. And here's the thing. I didn't turn it on because I wanted to be the only house glowing on the block like some smug little king. I turned it on because my house is older, and this neighborhood sits lower than it looks. Meaning there's one thing most people don't think about during winter storms until it's too late. Water. Basement water. The kind that doesn't care about insulation or your flooring budget. The generator was a real standby unit, professionally installed, permitted, and wired into a transfer switch, not a backyard science experiment. I'd paid extra for that, part on purpose. I wanted it boring. I wanted it legal. Because I learned a long time ago, the things you're forced to argue about later are never the things you expect. I crouched down and brushed ice off the starter cover, fingers already stiff even through gloves. The metal felt like it had been stored in a freezer. One breath, I'll turn the key. The generator rumbled awake like an animal clearing its throat, then stabilized into a steady hum, comforting in a way that made my shoulders drop inside. The lights came back, not every room, not every circuit, Just the essentials, the way we designed it. Heat source, refrigerator, a few outlets. And most important of all, the sump pump. I went down to the basement to confirm. The stairs creaked in that familiar way. The air down there was colder than usual, thick and damp, like the house was holding its breath. I walked to the sump pit and listened. That soft, periodic mechanical sound was there, like a small engine taking shallow breaths, working, doing its job. Holding the line, I exhaled. Upstairs. The world stayed quiet. The entire street had gone dark, porch lights out, Christmas decorations dead, the whole neighborhood looking abandoned. But my house had power, and out in the cold, that low generator hum became the only sign of life on the block. For the first 30 minutes, that was all it was. Me, my small bubble of light. And the sound of ice forming outside. I made coffee with the electric kettle and felt an odd kind of gratitude that I didn't have to boil water on a grill like it was. 1,890. And I'll admit it for a moment. I thought, okay, we're going to be fine. Then came the knock. Not a neighbor checking in. Knock, not a you, okay? Knock. A sharp, firm, authoritative knock that said, I believe I have jurisdiction here. For half a second, I actually thought someone needed help. Warmth. A phone charger. Somewhere to sit. I opened the door and a gust of freezing air punched into my entryway. Standing there was Marla Densley, HOA board president, or, as she liked to introduce herself, community association chair. Marla was dressed like the storm was just an inconvenience scheduled between errands. Long wool coat, leather gloves, earrings like they belonged at a charity auction, and in her hand, clipboard sealed in a clear plastic sleeve like she'd planned for precipitation. Behind her, the street was pure darkness. Houses dead. A downed branch silhouette. Further up the road, she smiled at me like we were old friends, but her eyes didn't. Good evening, she said, clipped and crisp. We've had a report. A report, I repeated. Marla didn't acknowledge that as a question. She pushed her glasses higher with the edge of her glove, like she was preparing to read me my rights. There's an unapproved piece of equipment operating on your property, she said. A generator. I stared at her because I honestly thought she might be joking. The street was literally dead, entire blocks without power, and she was standing here. Talking about approvals, you mean the standby generator, I asked? The one that's installed? Permitted? Marla made a tiny sound, like that information was irrelevant. It's causing a disturbance, she said. A nuisance complaint was filed. It violates quiet enjoyment. Then she flipped a page and added, as calmly as a robot. Section 8.3 prohibits continuous mechanical noise exceeding community standards. You're required to shut it down immediately. That phrase, quiet enjoyment, is one of those HOA terms that sounds like a right, but is usually used like a weapon. I leaned against the door frame and looked at the clipboard. What kind of complaint? I asked calmly. From who? I'm not at liberty to share that, she said, smoothly like she'd rehearsed it. But I am authorized to deliver enforcement notices. I could hear it now under her voice. The generator wasn't loud. It was a steady hum, almost polite, but it was noticeable. And to Marla, noticeable was unacceptable. Marla, I said, keeping my voice even? It's an ice storm. Everyone's power is out. She gave me the patient look people give a child explaining why they can't eat candy for dinner. We all have to make sacrifices during emergencies, she said. The community has standards. This equipment was not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. I have a county permit, I said. It was installed before I even moved in. That may be, she replied. But this association retains authority over what is operated externally, what constitutes a nuisance. Her tone stayed calm in the way bureaucracy stays calm when it's confident it can hurt you without raising its voice. Across the street, a neighbor's window flickered with candlelight. A shadow moved behind curtains. People were watching. That's the thing about HOAs. They don't need fences. They build pressure out of observation. Marla took a half step forward, just enough to imply she expected me to back up. I'm going to need you to turn it off, she said immediately. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue in circles. I just asked one question. Slow, Marla. Are you aware what that? The generator is powering? Her eyebrows lifted. Essential appliances, she said. But the community, no. I cut in gently. It's not rude, just firm. I mean specifically. She hesitated, and right there I realized something that made my stomach go cold. She didn't know. She had no idea. She just knew there was a sound. And sound meant control. I held her gaze. It powers my sump pump, I said. Marla blinked once. Then, her smile returned tighter. That sounds like a personal maintenance issue, she replied. The HOA way of saying, not my problem. And then she said the line that changed everything. If you do not shut it down, you will be fined. And the fine will increase every day you remain out of compliance. She clicked her pen, held the clipboard steady. Like the storm was irrelevant, like electricity was optional, like rules were oxygen. I stood there feeling the warmth of my house behind me and the cold air spilling in around her shoulders, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not rage, not anger, something colder, a recognition. This wasn't about the generator. It never was. This was about authority. And Marla was so confident in hers that she believed she could override weather. I nodded slowly. It's like I was considering it. Okay, I said. And Marla's? Shoulders relaxed, satisfied. Then my eyes drifted past her, down the hallway, to the basement door, to the steps leading into that cold, damp space. And in my head, I saw the sump pit again. The pump working. The water held back. Barely. I looked back at Marla, then past her into the black street, and I knew. With calm certainty that didn't feel dramatic until later, if I shut that generator off, the basement would flood, and Marla knew exactly what she was asking. Because one way or another, something was going to give. Marla stood on my porch like the storm was just background noise. Like the ice snapping branches in half, and the power grid collapsing was a minor inconvenience, something you dealt with after you dealt with compliance. She angled her clipboard so I could see the top page through the plastic sleeve. The letterhead read, "Notice a violation, immediate action, read even before I read a word of it." My stomach tightened, not because I thought she was right, not because I didn't know the generator was permitted, but because I knew what paperwork meant in an HOA neighborhood. It meant the calm voice of authority, meant timelines they controlled. It meant you chasing goalposts they got to move. Marla offered me her pen like she was doing me a favor. "I just need you to acknowledge receipt," she said. "Standard procedure. I'm not signing anything in the middle of an ice storm," I replied. Her smile didn't crack. "It doesn't matter if you sign," she said. "It only matters that you comply." It's what people don't understand about HOA pressure until it's aimed at them. They act like you're being given a choice, but they're really just narrating what they plan to do to you. I scanned. The notice, it was loaded with sterile phrases, the kind that make threats sound tidy. Nuisance, quiet enjoyment, unapproved mechanical equipment. Failure to comply may result in enforcement action, and then a line in bold. Waiting like a trap. Monetary penalties begin tomorrow. Tomorrow, I repeated. Yes, Marla said without hesitation. And the association has emergency enforcement authority. Emergency? It would have been funny if it wasn't my house on the line. The neighborhood was without power. Roads were slick. People were sitting in dark living rooms with blankets and candles, and she was claiming emergency authority too. Silence. A generator. Who approved this? I asked. Marla gave a tiny shrug. "The board," she said. "And I'm acting as the board's representative." That was Marla's whole style. She never said "I want." She never said "I'm bothered." She wrapped everything in the board like it was divine. I nodded once, slow. Then I said it again plainly. "Let me be clear. That generator is powering my sump pump." Her eyes flicked toward the dark houses behind her, then back to me. "Well," she said, voice level, "you'll need an alternative. The association's rules apply, regardless of circumstance. Regardless of circumstance. That phrase, still, echoes in my head because it captured everything. Reality changes. HOA logic tightens. She tapped the notice once with her pen. "I'll be checking back," she said, "and there will be an inspector." Then she walked away. Not hurried, not careful, like she owned the sidewalk. I watched her boots click lightly on the ice till she disappeared into the darkness. For a few seconds, I just stood there in the doorway. Cold. Leaking in, the generator humming steady beside my house like a heartbeat alive, and suddenly, somehow, CRIMINAL, I closed the door, not because I agreed with her, because the porch had started to feel like a stage. I could feel the neighborhood watching, not clearly, not openly, but the way you can feel eyes behind curtains. HOAs, trained communities. To monitor each other the way you monitor bad weather. I checked my phone. 2 messages. One from the HOA compliance. Email. One from an unknown number. The HOA email was already written like it belonged in a case file. "Dear homeowner, this message serves as documentation of your known compliance." 2 attachments, a violation notice, and a fine schedule. I opened it, and that's when the first real sense of being cornered settled in. Not rage, just math. The fine schedule was neat, merciless. $100 day. First week, $250 day. After that, legal. Fees added at discretion, and the line designed to make your stomach drop. Lien eligible after 30 days. Lien not an argument, not drama, a weapon aimed at the house itself. Then I opened the message from the unknown. Number. It was shorter, meaner turn. That thing off. People are trying to sleep. No name. No. Hello, just pressure. That's how it works. The HOA doesn't even have to punish you directly. The community becomes the tool. I stared at the message for a long moment, then replied with one sentence. "It's powering my sump pump during an ice storm." No. Response, not even a reaction, just silence. And somehow that silence felt worse than anger. I did a quick circuit of the house thermostat. Dropping, faucets dripping. To prevent freezing. Freezer checked. Phone. Updates checked, then dash another knock. This one wasn't Marla. No performance, no sweetness, just quick. Purposeful taps. When I opened the door, a man stood there in a reflective jacket with an HOA logo stitched across the chest, the kind of jacket you wear when you want to look official. Tablet in hand, expression blank, professionally uninterested. "Evening," he said. "Association compliance." He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask if I was okay, just angled his tablet toward my side yard like he was pointing at contraband. "We're here to verify shutdown." I blinked. "You're here to do what?" He repeated it exactly, like the words were programmed. "Verify shutdown." My throat went dry. Not because of him, because of what he represented. Marla hadn't even been gone an hour, and now they'd dispatched an inspector. Like my generator was a weapon. Like my home was a crime scene. Outside, the street was still dead black, somewhere far away. An ambulance siren moaned, muffled by ice and distance. This storm could kill someone, and my HOA had sent a compliance. "Officer, I'm not shutting it down," I said, not loud, just firm. The man sighed like I was wasting his time. "Well," he said, "that's your choice. But penalties begin tomorrow." He scrolled with his thumb. "And if you're still non-compliant by Monday, the association will involve counsel." Counsel. There it was again, that smooth, cold word for attorney. He didn't threaten me like a person. He threatened me like a system. And continued violation may result in lien consideration. Lien. I felt my heartbeat shift. Not faster, harder. Because at that moment, I realized something. I wasn't negotiating with Marla. I was negotiating with a machine designed to punish. I asked one question, even though I already knew the answer. "You have any exception for emergencies?" He didn't even look up. No, just no. Like freezing. Pipes didn't matter. Like flooding didn't matter. Like homes didn't matter. Rules were rules. And suddenly, I felt that sharp, tired kind of fear. Not panic, the fear of being forced to choose between two harms. Finally, I nodded. "All right," I said. "Give me a second." He stepped back, satisfied like he'd just won something. I put my boots on and walked into the ice. The generator hummed steadily, doing exactly what I paid it to do. Keeping the house alive, I stared at it for a long moment, then reached in. Turned it off. The hum died instantly. The silence afterward was so complete. It felt like the world had gone deaf. The compliance man made a note on his tablet. "Thank you," he said, already turning away. "You'll receive confirmation." And he left. No apology, no compassion, just procedure. I stood there a moment, with the cold biting my face, listening to the storm in the distance. Another crack with snapping under ice. Then I went back inside. The house felt different immediately. Not colder yet, but emptier, like something vital had been removed. I checked the thermostat again, dropping faster now. Then I paused, because something else had changed. 2, not a sound, the absence of one. The basement. The house has a way of carrying certain rhythms. And without the generator, the sump pump's quiet cycle was gone. No gentle word, no periodic click, just nothing. I stared at the basement door. My hand hovered over the knob a second too. Long before I opened it, cold air drifted up. I stepped down. Stairs creaked. Halfway to the bottom I noticed it, the smell. Basements always smell like concrete and dust, but this smelled different. Wetter? Wrong. I walked to the sump pit, crouched, shined my phone, flashlight down. At first it looked normal. Then my eyes adjusted and saw the wainer. Not overflowing, not yet, but rising slow and slow. And steady, like a bathtub filling after you forgot you left the faucet on. No pump, no defense, just water doing what water always does when pressure and gravity are on its side. I straightened up slowly, and as if the house needed one more way to confirm it, I heard it not from the pit, from inside the wall. A slow, ugly gurgling water moving through spaces that were never meant to hold it, like the house itself was filling up. And in that moment, the truth hit with awful clarity. Marla didn't just make me shut off my generator. She made me shut off the one thing keeping my home from being destroyed. And whatever was happening now was going to happen fast. I didn't run at first. That's the strange part. I stood there in my basement, staring at the sump pit like I could force it to behave just by watching it. The flashlight beam from my phone trembled slightly as my grip tightened. The water line had climbed past where it was earlier, past the mark my brain still insisted was safe. Not overflowing, not catastrophic, but rising with a purpose that felt almost intelligent, and the sound behind the wall got louder. Not a crash, not a burst. Pipe. Just steady movement, like something filling up out of sight. I put my palm flat against the concrete and felt it cold moisture. Faint vibration. That subtle warning a house gives you before it gives up. Then came the slosh. A soft, muffled slosh near the corner where the drywall met the floor, like a soaked sponge being stepped on. I turned and swept my phone light across the basement. I didn't need brightness to understand it. The concrete floor had darkened in patches, spreading slowly like ink. Water was coming in, and not just from the sump pit. The floor drained near. The laundry area bubbled once, then burped up a thin ribbon of brown water that smelled like wet leaves and something older, something municipal. My throat tightened, flooding. It doesn't just smell wet. It smells like drywall starting to rot before it even gets soaked. It smells like mold waking up. It smells like your house turning against you. I didn't have time to analyze. I had time to act. I took the stairs 2 at a time, boots thudding on the wood. Upstairs felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you all the little systems in your home are dead. I grabbed my coat and keys without thinking. Then I paused, because I already knew what I was about to do. I was going to restart the generator. The thing the HOA told me to shut off. The thing I had proof was permitted. The thing powering the sump pump that is now the only difference between inconvenience and destruction. But my hand stopped on the doorknob, not because I doubted the logic, because I could feel the eyes, like the neighborhood itself had leaned closer. I cracked the door open and looked out. The street was coated in ice. No street lights, no porch lights, just faint gray sky glow, reflecting off frozen pavement. And across the street behind a living room window, mauve MENTA silhouette, a neighbor standing there. Watching, not with malice, with interest, with that HOA-trained attentiveness. I swallowed, then opened the door fully and stepped into the cold. The air hit hard, sharp, biting, the kind of cold that turns your nostrils into glass. I moved quickly toward the generator, boots crunching and sliding over ice. My foot slipped once and I caught myself on the railing. The generator sat in its box like a loyal dog, harmless, obedient. I flipped the cover. My fingers shook with cold and adrenaline as I reached for the key, and then, "Excuse me," a voice cut across the yard, sharp and high. I turned, not Marla, but the same energy. It was Gina, the woman 2 doors down. Perfect hair, perfect nails, perfect irritation. She stood in her driveway with her coat cinched tight, phone held up like she was filming. "I thought you were told to turn that OFF," she yelled. My chest tightened at the absurdity of it. Standing in an ice storm, basement flooding, it's being confronted like I was committing theft. I shouted back. "My sump pump needs power. My basement is filling up." Gina's mouth tightened. "My baby finally got to sleep," she snapped. "Some of us haven't had quiet for hours." There it was. Not concern, not safety. Comfort. The expectation of comfort. Even during disaster, I stared at her for a beat and realized the truth. She didn't care what the generator did. She cared that someone else was doing something she didn't understand. The HOA hadn't approved it. I turned back to the generator, and my phone started vibrating, not one message. A bunch. My screen lit up again and again, like a panic pulse at first. It was confused. "Is your basement flooding too?" Then, "Did a pipe burst somewhere?" Then, "Water is coming up through my drain." WTF, I frowned, breath turning white. Then I got the one that made my stomach drop completely. "Marla's house is flooding. She's screaming at someone on the phone." I looked up the street instinctively. Too dark to see clearly, but storms carry sound strangely, and through the ice-heavy silence, I heard it. Not wind, not branches, voices shouting, then faintly an alarm. A home security alarm. It's going off somewhere down the street like a distress signal. My phone buzzed again. "Call 911. Water's pouring into our basement." Then a photo came through. Someone's stairwell with water halfway up it. Swirling with debris, my throat went dry. This wasn't just my basement. This wasn't a leak in my wall. This was neighborhood-wide. And it was happening right now like a chain reaction that had finally been triggered. I turned back to the generator. My hands didn't shake anymore. The hesitation was gone. Whatever social pressure existed had just been replaced by something older. Harder : survival. I turned the key. The generator coughed once, then rumbled to life, quickly settling into that steady hum. Behind me, the house lights flickered on, warm and constant, and from inside, I heard it. The sump pump, that blessed sound, a whir, a gulp, a rush, water moving in the direction I needed it to move. I stood there for half a second with my eyes closed, listening like it was music. Then I opened them again, and my stomach sank. Because Gina wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, more silhouettes gathered at windows. A porch door opened. A man stepped out with his phone held up, then another. Door opened. Another person came outside. People emerging into the cold like they'd been alerted by instinct. Not about safety, about me, about what I was doing, and then headlights. Cut across the ice. A car slid to a stop awkwardly. Tires crunching. A door opened. A figure stepped out in a long coat, even from that distance. I knew the posture. Marla, she marched toward my house like she was walking into court. Her hair was slightly disheveled, the first time I'd ever seen it less than perfect. No clipboard now. Just her phone in her hand. Like a weapon, she raised her voice before she even reached the driveway. "You turned it back on," she snapped, breathless with anger. I didn't respond right away. I just watched. Her dot the coat, the posture, the fury. But behind it is something else. "Panic, Marla," I said calmly. My basement was flooding. She pointed past me at the generator like it had insulted her personally. "You are in violation," she said. "You're disregarding a compliance order?" I nodded once. Then I asked the simplest question in the world. "Yours flooding too?" Her expression flickered. Just half a second, but that's all it took. Yes, and it was bad. She tried to recover immediately, lifting her chin like she could rebuild authority with posture. "Everyone's home is their own responsibility," she said sharply. I stared at her, and behind her a man stepped out into the street and yelled, "Marla, the drains are backing up. My whole basement is full." "What did you do?" Marla spun. "That is not," another voice cut in. "You told us the drainage project was handled," another person shouted. "My insurance says this was preventable." Marla froze like she'd been struck, like the meeting she controlled had spilled into the street, and she didn't have her gavel. For a moment, nobody spoke. The generator hummed steadily in the silence. Then Marla's phone buzzed. She glanced down at it, briefly like she'd forgotten she was holding it. I caught the top of the screen. "Emergency. Services dispatched." She looked back up at me, and her voice changed. The anger drained into something more dangerous. "Desperation. You need to turn it off," she said again. "Now." I blinked at her. "Marla, people are flooding. It's not your concern," she snapped. Then she caught herself, realizing how insane that sounded, and immediately switched tactics. "This is an act of God," she said quickly. "This is a weather event." I held her gaze. My heart wasn't racing now. It wasn't emotion driving me. It was logic. "A weather event doesn't make sewage come up through drains," I said quietly. Marla's face hardened. "You are not a city engineer," she said coldly, "and you are not permitted to operate unapproved external equipment." Unapproved. There it was again. The generator. It wasn't illegal, wasn't unsafe, wasn't unpermitted. But to her it was unapproved because the HOA didn't control it, and now her own home was flooding, her own carpet, her own drywall, her own curated life, and she was still trying to enforce a noise complaint. That's when it clicked for me in a way that felt almost peaceful. Marla didn't fear the storm. She feared losing jurisdiction. Even in disaster, she needed obedience. Except reality had finally slapped the entire neighborhood in the face. A siren wailed again, closer this time. Marla's eyes darted toward it, and for the first time I saw it. The crack. Not rage, not humiliation. Just a flash of human fear slipping through the authority. I looked past her down the street. People were moving now. Car doors open. Flashlights. A Mason neighbor carried towels like sandbags. Someone yelled about shutting off water lines. And underneath it all, I heard the sound again, that gurgling, not just under my house, under the whole street. Like the neighborhood itself was filling up. "Marla, turn back to me one last time. This will be addressed," she said through clenched teeth. Then she spun around and hurried toward, her house slipping slightly on the ice as she went. I stood there in my yard, cold air cutting into my lungs, watching her leave, and something settled in my gut with calm clarity. The flooding wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just weather. It was infrastructure. Drainage, maintenance, neglect, and the HOA had spent years obsessing over appearances and fines. While something beneath the neighborhood quietly waited to fail, I looked at my generator, humming steady, doing its job. And I realized something deeper than a noise complaint. The HOA didn't just overreach by trying to shut off my generator. They might have been covering up or ignoring the very issue that had just wrecked the neighborhood. And if that was true, this wouldn't end with a fine. This was going to end with receipts. After the first hour of chaos, the neighborhood stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a problem. People weren't talking about dinner anymore. They weren't talking about work. They were talking about water lines, pumps, drains, insurance. I could hear it in the voices outside, sharp, rushed, thin with stress. Somewhere down the street, a garage door tried to open with no power and gave up halfway like a trapped animal. Someone yelled a name. Another voice yelled back. And underneath it all, that storm silence stayed. The kind of silence that makes every sound feel amplified. Even with my generator back on. Even with my house lit and the sump pump running hard. I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Because the HOA was still the HOA in storms. It's pass. But paperwork stays. I'd learned something long before this neighborhood. Long before this house. If you're going to survive any kind of overreach, you don't rely on memory. You rely on a record. So while my neighbors were hauling towels and ripping up soaked carpet, I did something that probably looks strange from the outside. I sat at my kitchen table and started building a file. Not dramatic, not heroic, just methodical. Because I could already hear the future coming. I could already hear Marla saying, the association acted within its authority. I could already see the rewritten story they'd try to sell. And I wasn't going to let them rewrite mine. I opened a folder on my laptop and named it Ice Storm. HOA. Then I started saving everything. The violation notice, the fine schedule. Every email.everytimestamp.photos of the generator running in a dead dark street. Short video clip of the sump pump working after I turned the power back on, and then, because I could already predict the argument that was coming, I opened a decibel meter app. Not because I believed the HOA's noise complaint was fair. Because I wanted one more thing they couldn't argue with later. I walked outside. Held my phone near the generator and watched the numbers settle, even in a silent, blacked-out neighborhood. It was well within normal limits. I documented it anyway then. I pulled out the home file. You know the one. The thick folder everybody swears they'll keep organized, till life forces them to touch it. Mine was a manila monster shoved into a drawer. For emergencies, I dumped it onto the table. Deed, survey, PLAT map, closing paperwork, and the HOA documents. I'd barely glanced at when I moved in, because they all looked like boilerplate, until the day they didn't. I spread it all under the warm light of my dining room fixture. Outside, voices carried through the ice. Inside, it was quiet enough to think. I started with the deed, because the deed is the thing. Nobody reads until they have to. It looks like dead legal language. It feels irrelevant, till someone tries to tell you what you can and cannot do on land you pay taxes on. I traced the legal description with my finger. Lot number, subdivision, boundary, references.asemp. Then I unfolded the plat map, and the plat map told me more about this neighborhood than any HOA newsletter ever had, where boundaries actually were, where utility corridors ran, where drainage lines cut through. And then saw it not bold, not flashy, just a thin line running behind my property and the next two lots, labeled with one word HOAs love to pretend doesn't exist. Easement, and not just any easement, a drainage easement. My stomach tightened. I stared at it, then stared at my lot number. Then at the HOA boundary overlay in the CC and Rs, and for the first time all night, something shifted inside me. My hands stopped shaking, not because the storm had passed, because I suddenly understood what I was dealing with. My lot was, outside the neighborhood, but not perfectly inside the HOA's clean rectangle of control either. It wasn't obvious. It was the kind of legal ambiguity HOAs count on homeowners never investigating, but there it was in ink. My lot was part of an older parcel that had been subdivided, then later absorbed into the newer development, meaning the HOA assumed authority over it. Because everyone assumed authority over it, but assumptions aren't law. So I pulled out the CC&Rs and flipped to the part that mattered. Annexation. If your lot isn't included in the original declaration, it has to be annexed legally. Not socially, not well. It's in the neighborhood, so it counts. Legally annexed. That means paperwork recorded with the county. I read the annexation section, slowly twice. Then I checked the attachments, then the exhibit list, then the referenced exhibit numbers, and the hair on my arms lifted, because the annexation language was there. But the proof was not. No recorded annexation document for my lot, no. Exhibit listing my parcel. No clear chain of authority, just confidence. And I realized in that moment, Marla's confidence wasn't built on truth. It was built on nobody checking. I opened my laptop and pulled up the county recorder's site, typed in my parcel number, scrolled through recorded documents, deeds, mortgages, releases, easement filings. But no HOA annexation record tied to my parcel. I leaned back slowly, chair creaking, not triumphant, just aware, in plain English. They might not even legally own me, and that alone could crack them. But there was more, because even if the HOA did have authority, that authority wasn't unlimited. Most HOAs can regulate aesthetics, paint colors, fence heights, roof, replacements. They can punish you for an ugly mailbox, but interfering with safety equipment. During an emergency, that steps into a different world. Municipal code, public policy, health and safety. The world where HOAs tend to get smacked down, and somebody finally pushes back properly. So I kept digging. County emergency preparedness guidance, state HOA enforcement, limits. I wasn't trying to become a lawyer overnight. I just needed to know enough to recognize overreach when I saw it. And what I found was simple, not always clean, not always perfectly worded. But clear enough, an HOA can issue fines, but it must follow procedure. Proper notice opportunity for hearing consistent enforcement documented authority, and most importantly, it can't create rules that conflict with basic health and safety protections. The generator wasn't a luxury during that storm. It wasn't a flex, it was mitigation. Keeping heat and preventing flood damage isn't an aesthetic choice, it's survival. I sat there, papers spread around me, and for the first time, it's the helpless feeling drained out of my chest. Not replaced by anger, replaced by plan. I organized everything into piles. HOA threats violation notice. Fine schedule. Emergency enforcement email. My compliance permit. Inspection approval. Installation documentation. HOA authority. OR lack of IT deed. Plat map. Annexation clause. Missing exhibits. Storm timeline. Outage alert. Thermostat drop. Sump pump failure window. Water intrusion photos. Then I took photos of the piles like it was an evidence board. Because that's what it was. Evidence. Outside, I noticed headlights. I glanced out the window and saw Marla's SUV parked in front of her house. Hazards blinking weakly. Her garage door was open. A man was carrying buckets out, and even from that distance I could tell her home had flooded badly. I shouldn't have felt anything about that, but I did. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just a quiet understanding. When people lose control, they grab harder, and Marla was about to grab. I turned back to my papers. One thing still bothered me, that drainage easement, because flooding across multiple homes in one storm, especially with sewage backup signs, is usually not random. It's usually blocked easements, collapsed drainage lines, neglected maintenance, failed grading, infrastructure issues that get ignored until they become disasters. And HOAs love delaying infrastructure repairs. They love postponing expensive, invisible work. While spending money on visible things, like landscaping and entry signs, because grass and flowers win elections, drainage systems don't. Then I remembered something. A vague email from months ago, stormwater concerns framed like it, was routine. I opened my email archive and typed keywords. Drainage stormwater reserve easement. The results populated slowly. Then I found it, a subject line from 8 months earlier. Board update. Drainage improvements discussion. Clicked. The email was polished, the sanitized language HOAs use when they don't want to alarm residents. Engineers.bids.next.
Act stats.
It sounded responsible, but at the bottom, buried like an afterthought, was a link. Meeting minutes. So I pulled those up. The HOA resident portal wasn't secure, just annoying. I logged in, clicked through, and found. Meeting minutes. Augusti scrolled until old business, then a bullet point. Drainage project proposal. Discussion of reserve allocation. I slowed down to read it carefully. They discussed repairs. They discussed risk. They even documented an engineer warning about an increased probability of failure during winter storm events. I blinked. Read it again? Then I kept going until Treasurer report, and that's where I found the line that made my pulse slow, cold, deliberate. A single sentence, clean, administrative, deadly. Motion approved to temporarily reallocate allocated. Reserve funds to cover administrative and legal expenses. I stared at it. Read it twice. Administrative and legal expenses in plain English. Lawyers.collections, enforcement.HOA warfare. And here's what mattered. They had money set aside for drainage. They knew it mattered. They knew failure was likely, and they moved the funds. Anyway, quietly in meeting minutes, most people never read. I sat back in my chair, hands flat on the table. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, my house hummed steady with generator power, a small engine of stability, and I realized something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just Marla panicking and lashing out. This was a system protecting itself. Because now the neighborhood was flooding. The HOA had already been warned. I saved the minutes as a PDF, renamed it, and dropped it into my folder like a brick. Then I closed my laptop slowly, and in the silence that followed, I said one sentence out loud to nobody. Okay. Not angry, not afraid, just ready. Because now it wasn't a fight about a generator. Now it was a fight about what they'd done with everyone's money, what they chose not to fix. By morning, the storm had shifted from emergency to aftermath. Ice was still there, thick on the trees, heavy on roofs, catching what little light the gray sky offered. The whole neighborhood looked like someone dipped it in glass and left it to harden, but the sound had changed. No more cracking limbs, no more distant sirens. Instead, it was the sound of consequences, wet vacs roaring in open garages, sub-pumps plugged into extension cords, residents dragging ruined carpet to the curb like they were hauling out pieces of their lives. And in the middle of all that, the HOA was still the HOA, still emailing, still documenting, still acting like the most. Pressing emergency in the neighborhood was me. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop again. My ice storm, HOA. Folder now had subfolders, not because I wanted to play detective, because I'd realized something the night before. If I let them frame this as me versus the HOA, I would lose. Even if I was right, even if they were wrong, because they'd turn it into a troublesome homeowner and bury it in procedure. But if I framed it as documentation versus misconduct, I could win without raising my voice. So I stopped playing defense, and I started writing. I didn't write an angry email. I didn't write a rant. I wrote the kind of letter that makes bureaucrats sit up straighter. When they read it. .com. Structured. Numbered. Boring in the way that scares people who rely on intimidation. At the top, date, my address. The HOA's registered mailing address, then : Notice of violation standby generator use during emergency power outage. The first paragraph was simple. I acknowledge receipt. I dispute the violation. I request the matter be placed on hold pending. A hearing and evidence review? Then I listed facts, not feelings. Facts. The generator is count, permitted and professionally installed. Exhibit A, the generator powers essential safety systems including my sump pump. Exhibit B, the association attempted enforcement without due process and hearing. Exhibit C, the association's authority over my parcel is unclear. Proof is requested. Exhibit D. Then I wrote the line that mattered most, the one that forces the whole machine to slow down. Please provide the recorded instrument county filing reference. Demonstrating my parcel is annexed into the association's enforcement authority. I wasn't asking for permission. I was asking for proof, because I already knew if they had it, they'd send it instantly. If they didn't, it'd start scrambling. I attached exhibits like a court filing, permit, an inspection report, plat map with drainage markings, deed legal description, time-stamped HOA enforcement emails sent. During the storm, decibel readings. I sent the letter by email, then I printed it, then I mailed it certified. Because HOAs love to lose things, and I wanted this paper trail to exist in two worlds, digital and physical. Next, I filed records requests. This is where HOAs get nervous because it forces them out of vibe-based authority and into accountability. I requested 3 things that mattered. The complaint log related to generator noise at the engineer drainage recommendations reports. Reserve records showing how money was allocated and spent, because if someone lied, would be written down somewhere, and I didn't send it only to Marla. I sent it to the entire board, because I didn't want this staying inside her hands where it could be misplaced. That afternoon, my phone rang. A local surveyor, his voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that comes from someone who has spent his career explaining to emotional people that the property line doesn't care what they believe. I took a look at what you sent, he said. Your lot is weird, I know, I replied. He chuckled once. Not weird like you're imagining. Weird like the developer got creative. Then he translated it into plain terms. Part of my parcel traced. Back to older subdivision filings. The HOA declaration boundaries didn't cleanly include it. Annexation should have been recorded separately. And if it wasn't recorded, then HOA enforcement authority over my lot was weaker than everyone assumed. He offered to put it in writing. A surveyor isn't a friend. A surveyor is truth with a license. 2 hours later, another message came in, not from the surveyor, from an unknown number. Do not forward this, but you're right. Drainage money was moved. I tried to stop it. No signature, no name, but I knew exactly who it was because I'd seen him once at a meeting quiet in the back, looking like someone who regretted volunteering. The treasurer, Calvin. He was the kind of guy who ends up treasurer because he's good at spreadsheets and has no idea what he just agreed to. And I understood immediately why he was texting me now, because he knew where this was headed. He sent an attachment. A photo of a printed ledger sheet. It wasn't dramatic at first glance, just numbers. But numbers don't care who's yelling, and right there in black and white was proof that reserve funds had been shifted, not stolen in a cartoon villain way, moved, double quotes, temporarily. With justification language broad enough to cover anything, administrative and legal expenses. I stared at it for a long moment, then I saved it in my folder, backed it up on a flash drive, and emailed it to myself under an unrelated subject line. Because once you start uncovering this kind of thing, you stop assuming anything is safe. That evening my phone rang again. This time the caller introduced herself properly. Hi, my name is Elise. I'm with the county paper. I paused. Small-town journalists don't call you unless someone tipped them off. And instantly I wondered, which board member panicked who tried to get ahead of this? Elise spoke carefully, like she was reading invisible notes. I'm hearing the HOA tried to shut down emergency generators during the storm, she said, and that multiple homes flooded. I didn't hype it. I didn't editorialize. I just said yes. Then I added, and I have the documents. There was a short silence, the kind that says she just realized this story has bones. I'm not trying to be a headline, I told her. Understood, she replied. But this may not be about you anymore. That's what I'd been thinking too. HOAs thrive when they can isolate one person. What they hate. What breaks them is parody, not revenge. Parody. So I didn't go hunting for garden gnomes and dead mailbox colors. I went after what mattered. The drainage easement. I walked the neighborhood slowly. Calm hands in my pockets like I was just another homeowner surveying storm damage. And what I saw made my jaw tighten. Landscaping berms built right. Over drainage paths. Decorative rock dumped where water was supposed to flow. Downspouts aimed directly into the easement, like someone wanted the street to flood. A homeowner discharging sump water into a shared line illegally. Then I turned a corner and stopped. A shed. Not small. Not subtle. A large shed with fresh skirting and clean lumber, expensive and recent, built partially over the easement line. I stared at it for a moment, then checked the plat map on my phone, checked the boundary. Again, then checked the house, and my stomach dropped for a different reason. It was Marla's property. I stood there in the cold, staring at it, not angry, not excited, just amazed, because there it was, a perfect summary of the entire HOA mindset. Marla tried to shut down my safety equipment in an ice storm, while her own property had a structure interfering with the drainage system that might have contributed to the flooding. I photographed everything. Wide shots, close-ups, angles that clearly showed location relative to the plat. Then, I went home and added it to the folder. 2 days later, the HOA email hit everyone's inbox. Subject line: Emergency Community Meeting, Mandatory, ATTN, DNCA, Mandatory. That word alone told me everything. Then the body text. Due to recent events and certain homeowner actions, the board will be addressing community compliance concerns, certain homeowner actions. They didn't name me. They didn't have to. And then the line that made me smile without humor. Generators are prohibited pending further notice. Prohibited. Just like that? A rule change after the fact. A desperate grab for control. 5 minutes later, I got another email, not to the community, just to me, from Marla. Short, sharp, personal. Your behavior has created disruption in this community. You are being difficult for no reason. The board will be discussing your violations in the meeting. There it was. Not enforcement now. Public punishment. Not due process. A. Performance. They weren't calling me in to resolve anything. They were calling me in to show the neighborhood what happens. When you don't bow your head, I stared at that email for a long moment. Then I opened my folder, checked my exhibits, printed fresh copies of the drainage meeting minutes, printed the surveyor's note, printed Marla's own storm night enforcement notices, and slipped everything into a plain binder. Because if Marla wanted to make an example out of me, she was about to learn the difference between control and proof. And as I closed the binder, I said quietly to myself, okay, not surrender, A. Signal. Because the next time the neighborhood gathered in one room, the HOA wouldn't be holding the only narrative. The meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock p.m. by 5:20. The clubhouse parking lot was already full. Cars were wedged into spots that weren't spots, half on curb, half on grass. Headlights carved slow beams through the lingering winter haze. Patches of ice still clung to shaded corners like the storm refused to fully leave. When I stepped out of my car, the first thing I noticed was the sound, not conversation. A low collective murmur, tight and angry, like a crowd waiting for a verdict. People were filing toward the clubhouse doors in heavy coats, boots still wet from slush and melt. Some carried binders, some carried folders. One woman carried a clear plastic tote filled with soaked paper towels, like it was evidence pulled from her basement, and everywhere I looked, saw it calling, phones not scrolling, recording. Because when the HOA loses control, people suddenly remember they have cameras. Inside, the clubhouse smelled like damp wool and stale coffee. The heat was cranked too high, fighting cold air that kept pouring in every time the door opened. The entrance floor was slick with melted ice. Wet boots squeaked. Cross tile. Someone had dragged folding chairs into rows, but it wasn't enough. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, arms crossed, faces tight. Some held printed photos, basements filled with water, ruined, drywall, floating storage bins, a child's toy half submerged in brown. Floodwater, not just property damage, violation because when your home floods, it doesn't feel like you lost carpet, it feels like you lost safety. I found a seat near the back, not hiding, just not interested in being theatrical. My binder sat on my lap, plain organized, no slogans, no theatrics. I could still feel eyes. On me, not hostile, not supportive, just curious, because the HOA had made sure everyone knew the meeting would address certain homeowner actions. I was the headline they wanted, but the crowd didn't feel like it came for me. They came for blood, not physical blood. Accountability. Blood. The board sat behind a folding table at the front, like a panel of judges. Marla was in the center. Perfect. Posture. Perfect expression. As if this were a normal Tuesday, she wore a blazer that didn't belong in a room filled with people who just dragged wet carpet into their yards. On either side of her were two other board members, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. At the far end sat a man in a suit. HOA. Attorney, not flashy, just expensive in quiet ways. Clean cuffs, polished shoes, controlled breathing. A folder in front of him and a pen resting between his fingers like he might need to underline someone's life. This wasn't a community meeting. This was a staged proceeding. Marla tapped the microphone. It squealed and died. She tapped again. Feedback screamed through the room. A few residents groaned. Marla's smile tightened like it was being stapled in place. Finally, the mic caught. "Good evening," she said. Her voice came through, loud and clean, practiced. "Thank you for coming. I understand emotions are high, but we are going to proceed according to proper procedure." At a procedure. That's always the first shield, because procedure sounds fair even when it's being used as a weapon. She continued. "As you all know, we experienced a severe weather event. This was an act of nature. No one could have predicted a man near the front stood so fast his chair scraped hard across the floor." "Bullshit," said. Not screamed, stated like a fact. Marla blinked once. "We do not allow profanity. My basement is destroyed," the man snapped. "My furnace is ruined. My insurance told me this wasn't just weather." That line landed. A few heads nodded hard. The man continued, voice shaking now. "They said this happens when drainage systems fail or get blocked. So don't sit there and tell us this is just nature." The murmurs rose. A woman held her phone up and spoke loudly enough for the mic to catch her from the crowd. "I have pictures. My entire basement is brown water." "Brown? How is that weather?" Another resident shouted. "Why did we have a drainage fund if nothing was fixed?" Mouth tightened. She leaned into the mic again. "Please," she said sharply, "this is not the forum for accusations. We are here to discuss community expectations and compliance issues that were violated during the storm." Compliance issues? There it was again. The HOA always returns to enforcement like it's religion, and right on cue. Marla turned her head, just enough to look directly at me. "We have received serious complaints regarding nuisance disruptions," she said, "including unapproved generator use." The room shifted, not toward me, toward her. Like, crowd collectively leaning in to punish audacity, because even the neighbors who'd hated the generator were now standing in ruined drywall. Nobody wanted to hear about quiet enjoyment. They wanted to hear why their furniture was on the curb. Marla lifted a sheet of paper. She was about to read my violation notice publicly. I could tell the attorney beside her gave the smallest nod. "Proceed." And that's when stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, just rose with the binder in my hand, like it was the most normal thing in the world to calmly interrupt an ambush. "Marla," I said. My voice carried better than I expected. The room quieted immediately. Not for her, it's for me, because they were starving for something real. Marla frowned. "This is not— you called this an emergency meeting," I said calmly. "So let's handle an emergency." Then I glanced around the room. I'm going to speak briefly, and then you can return to procedure however you'd like. The attorney cleared his throat. I'd like to remind everyone I looked at him directly, not aggressive, just steady. I'm not asking permission. I said. That sentence hit the room like a match, not because it was rude, because it was different. Hoes. Survive on people asking permission? I opened my binder. I'm going to show you 5 documents, I said, and then I'm going to sit back down. Marla narrowed her eyes. There is no record of this meeting. I smiled faintly. There is now, I said. Someone in the crowd actually chuckled, short and bitter. I held up the first page. Exhibit a county generator permit. Inspection passed. Professionally installed. I looked around the room. No emotion, no anger, just truth. The HOA violation notice was issued during the outage, I continued. It demanded immediate shutdown. I complied. Within minutes, my sump pump stopped and my basement began flooding. People leaned forward. I held up my phone. Exhibit B time-stamped footage of the sump pump running before shutdown, and water intrusion immediately after. A woman whispered, "Oh my God!" I flipped the page. Exhibit C, the HOA fine ladder sent to me. Daily fines, attorney involvement, lien threats. During an ice storm, that one detonated the room. You threatened a lien, someone shouted. During a storm? Marla raised her hands as if she could press the room back into silence. Please, please. But the dam had already cracked. Followed procedure, she said quickly. The governing documents allow enforcement. I turned another page. Exhibit D, my deed and plat map, I said. My parcel has unclear annexation into HOA enforcement authority. Now Marla's face changed. Not irritation, alarm, because that wasn't a disagreement. That was a challenge to her jurisdiction. I didn't even push it yet. I simply let it exist in the air. Then I flipped to the page I already knew would change. The entire meeting, Exhibit E, HOA meeting minutes from 8 months ago. I looked down, then up. They discussed drainage repairs. Murmurs, they documented risk of winter storm failure. A man near the wall said, almost to himself, "No." Then I read it out loud. Motion approved to temporarily reallocate, allocated. Reserve funds to cover administrative and legal expenses. The room went still. Not quiet like respect, still like shock, because the implication was unavoidable. They had money. They knew, and they moved it. Anyway, Marla's mouth opened, closed. Her attorney leaned forward, pen no longer resting calmly. This document, Marla began. But the crowd erupted. You moved the funds. Are you kidding me? My basement is destroyed, and you were paying lawyers. A woman in the front raised her phone and shouted. My husband asked about this at a meeting. He told us it was handled? The volume rose into something uglier than rage. It was the sound of trust collapsing. Marla grabbed the microphone like she could strangle the truth. Back into silence. This is exactly why we have procedure? She snapped. This is not the appropriate forum. But the word forum only made them angrier. Because what she meant was, you don't get to accuse us in public. And the crowd had decided public was the only place truth could survive. That's when Calvin, the treasurer, stood up. He wasn't at the board table. He was off to the side like a man who'd been waiting for permission to confess. His hand went. Eyes snapped toward him like a warning. Calvin swallowed hard. Then he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. It's true. The room went even quieter. Calvin's voice cracked. He kept going. I told the board it was a mistake, he said. Told them we needed to leave drainage reserves untouched. His eyes flicked to Marla, but the motion passed. Marla's face went pale. The attorney leaned in, whispered urgently to her, not discreet enough. I caught 2 words, liability and exposure. Calvin cleared his throat, and he hesitated, then forced it out. I want an audit. You could feel the entire room inhale like one body. A man yelled, we need a recall vote. Another voice, Marla should resign tonight. Marla slammed her hand on the table. This is disorderly, the attorney stood. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, polished and firm, I understand. Frustration, but there will be no personal attacks. The storm was an act of God, and the association acted within its authority. A woman lifted a photo over her head like a weapon. Authority? She shouted. Authority doesn't fix my furnace. Someone else shouted. Authority doesn't explain why the drainage easement is blocked. And then the clubhouse doors opened. A cold gust swept in. Every head turned. A man stepped inside, wearing a county jacket. Not HOA county. He held a clipboard, too. But his didn't come from imagined authority. It came from law. I'm looking. For the board? Said the room went dead quiet. Marla froze. The county inspector walked down the aisle slowly, boots leaving wet prints. He looked around like he'd already heard enough. I've received multiple complaints, he said regarding drainage, easement, obstruction, and potential stormwater discharge code violations. My heartbeat didn't speed up. It slowed, because this is the thing HOAs fear most. They can bully homeowners. They can intimidate neighbors. But they can't intimidate the county. The inspector looked at Marla, ma'am. He said evenly, we will be conducting an enforcement review. Then he added, easements cannot be obstructed. Not by landscaping, not by sheds, not by anything. The room felt electric. Marla's lips pressed into a line so tight it looked painful. The attorney leaned toward her again, whispering so urgently. It wasn't even discreet anymore. And Marla's eyes widened. Her confidence wasn't breaking. It was evaporating. The attorney straightened, scanned the room, and said, we're going to take a brief recess. Gears rose instantly, but he raised a hand. Firmer now. This is in the association's best interest, he said. Then the board gathered their papers quickly, too quickly, and they disappeared through a side door. The crowd stayed. Behind, standing, talking, recording, demanding. I sat back down. Binder closed. Because the evidence had done what it was supposed to do. Not create chaos. Create truth. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the side door opened again. The attorney walked into the room. Alone. No board members. No. Marla. He didn't return to his seat. He stepped straight to the microphone, adjusted his tie, took one breath, then said the sentence that dropped the temperature. In the room, due to information presented tonight, I am withdrawing from advising Ms. Marla densely in any individual capacity. A wave moved through the crowd. Not a shout, not a cheer, a stunned, satisfied tremor, because everyone felt it at the same time. The attorney who came to control the room had just abandoned the person who built the machine. And I didn't feel triumphant. I felt certain, because this wasn't just exposure anymore. This was collapse. The days after that meeting didn't feel like victory. They felt like the moment after a car accident. When your body finally stops moving, but your mind keeps replaying the impact in slow motion, trying to understand what just happened. The neighborhood was still wrecked. Basements still being gutted. Drywall stacked in jagged piles. Along the curb, like broken teeth, fans and dehumidifiers humming in open garages, until the streets sounded like a machine room, but something had shifted. Not emotionally, structurally, because for the first time since I moved in, the HOA's authority didn't feel like a law of nature. It felt like what it had always been, a group of people in a system that only worked because everyone believed it was untouchable. And after that meeting, no one believed anymore. The next morning, before 9 a.m., a notice hit everyone's inbox. The association has retained separate counsel for board representation moving forward. It was written like routine housekeeping, like an HR update, but nobody read it that way, because everyone understood what it really meant. When an HOA attorney publicly separates from a board president, it's not about optics, it's about liability. Marla's name wasn't mentioned, but her absence screamed. And strangely, it's how her humbling began. Not in public, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet, brutal way systems distance themselves from the person who set them on fire. 2 days later, the county arrived. Not one inspector, 3. They walk through the neighborhood with clipboards and GPS tools, taking photos the way I had, only theirs weren't going into a folder on a laptop. Theirs were going into enforcement files. I watched from my driveway as one inspector stopped behind my lot at the drainage easement. He looked at the blocked area's berms, decorative rock, landscaping, and that shed. And he shook his head slowly like he couldn't believe anyone would be that reckless. This should have never been allowed, he said. Word traveled fast, even faster than HOA gossip. By afternoon, there was a county notice taped to the clubhouse door, not fancy, not theatrical, just government language, blunt in a way HOAs hate. Notice of violation, easement, obstruction, stormwater management, unowned COMP Leon suit. Once the county shows up, the HOA loses its favorite tricks. Can't fine a county inspector? You can't threaten a lien on a code violation. You can't hide behind procedure. You comply. Or the law compels you. The treasurer, Calvin, didn't disappear after the meeting. He didn't retreat into silence. He did the opposite. He sent a message to the entire SOT. Real one. Not sanitized. Not padded with, we appreciate. Your patience, he wrote. As treasurer, I am requesting a full audit of reserve spending and board-approved reallocations. Residents deserve transparency. That message made Marla's position impossible, because once someone inside breaks the seal, the HOA can no longer claim the problem as one difficult homeowner. Now it's internal. Now it's systemic. Within a week, the board announced an independent ALIDA, temporary freeze on enforcement fines related to storm events, a review of emergency preparedness policy, and then quietly, they added the line that told me everything was already collapsing. The association will be considering leadership changes. Leadership changes. HOA language 4. We're sacrificing someone to survive. The neighborhood didn't calm down. They got organized. Not like a mob, like an audit. Clipboards appeared at mailboxes. Neighbors, who had never spoken longer than 10 seconds, stood in groups comparing insurance emails and damage totals. Recall petitions circulated, not led by me, led by residents whose homes had flooded. People who used to defend the HOA because they believed rules protected property values. Now, they understood what I'd learned in that basement. Rules don't protect your home. Maintenance does. The petition reached the signature threshold in less than a week, when the recall meeting was scheduled. The turnout wasn't angry anymore. It was determined. People weren't there to shout. They were there to end something. And when the results were read, it wasn't dramatic. It was calm, official, like a ledger entry. Marla densely removed. 2. Board members resigned before they could be voted out. A temporary board was seated, and Calvin, the reluctant truth-teller, was asked to stay on as acting treasurer until the audit finished. Marla didn't scream. She didn't storm out. That's not how these collapses happen in real life. She sat there stiffly, staring forward, reduced to what she'd always been beneath the authority, a person hiding behind paperwork. Out. Until paperwork finally turned around and pointed back at her. A few days after the recall, I got one more email toward from Marla, not sent as board president. Anymore? Just Marla, still? Is trying to force the universe to obey her formatting? It was short, cold, threatening in that familiar HOA way. Will still be held responsible for prior violations. While collections will proceed. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did the thing I'd trained myself to do. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't insult. I replied with one sentence and an attachment. Please direct all further communication to the association's counsel and the county enforcement file attached. Then I attached the county notice, and that was the last message I ever received from her, because intimidation only works while you're standing alone. And she wasn't standing in front of a homeowner anymore. She was standing in front of records over the next month. The consequences arrived the way true consequences usually do. Not loudly, but relentlessly. The HOA signed written restrictions. limiting enforcement actions during declared emergencies. The association was formally warned against interfering with permitted emergency equipment, including generators used for heat and flood prevention. The audit confirmed what meeting minutes had hinted at. Reserve funds were moved improperly. Spending was approved without proper disclosure. Administrative, legal, expenses had ballooned during enforcement spikes. No handcuffs, no dramatic takedown, just accountability. It's tightening like a vice. And then, the HOA's insurance carrier got involved. That's the part people don't realize when insurers get nervous. HOA boards start acting like humans again, because suddenly their choices have a cost they can't bully away. By spring, real work finally began. Not cosmetic work, real work. Drainage. Engineers hired, easement cleared, stormwater flow restored, maintenance schedule posted publicly, and yes, the shed came down quietly, expensively, like it had never been there. The new board implemented changes that should have existed from day one. Budgets posted for residents, reserve allocation approvals documented clearly, meeting minutes published. Within 72 hours, an emergency exception clause added. Permitted emergency equipment is allowed during outages and storm events. And most important of all, they clarified boundaries. No more we decide what applies. They hired a property attorney to confirm jurisdiction and annexation properly. If your lot wasn't annexed, they stopped pretending otherwise. One morning, weeks later, I stepped outside and realized the generator wasn't running. It didn't need to. Power had been stable. The weather had softened. Ice was gone from branches. The neighborhood smelled like wet earth and thawed grass instead of cold metal. I stood in my side yard looking at the generator. It sat there quietly, clean, legal, boring, exactly the way it always should have been. And across the street, I saw something I hadn't seen before the storm. People talking to each other like neighbors. Not surveillance, not enforcement, community. It wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was healthier, because people finally learned something the hard way. Authority is not competence, and compliance is not safety. I thought about Marla, and to my surprise, I didn't hate her. What I felt was clarity. She wasn't a monster. She was a person rewarded for controlling others, till she mistook control for truth. And when reality hit, when basements filled and documentation surfaced, she grabbed. Harder, but power doesn't survive contact with facts. Not forever. That's the part people miss. You don't beat overreach by becoming louder than it. You beat it by becoming clearer than it. You build records. You learn process. You refuse to be provoked into looking irrational, and you let truth do what it always does when it's properly documented. It makes lies expensive. I went back inside, closed the door, felt the warmth settle around me.com. Steady, safe. And that's the moral I carry now. Quietly, without drama. Don't fight power with rage. Fight it with truth. Because overreach always collapses the same way, not when someone screams. But when it meets records, it can't erase.